Hello, welcome to another episode at Advocata Studio. Today we are going to discuss about one of the most popular words in Sri Lanka. Corruption, not pretty much about corruption, but how to go beyond corruption and how to stop corruption is the theme of the conversation today. And joining with me is Dhewni Dias from Transparency International. Dhewni, welcome to Advocata Studio and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Dhananath. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. And I'm sure after elections are over and now we are heading to another election cycle, I'm sure you must be very busy because everyone talks about corruption and it was not the first time that we have been speaking, but I feel the temperature is that there's a fresh breath of air, like everyone wants to do something and everyone thinks that something can be done. To begin with, what's actually corruption? What's the definition? Because people think that someone comes robbing a bank, someone comes and taking the money over. Let's start from the basics. What's actually corruption?
Okay, so Transparency International, which is our main body, our secretariat, we have a definition, and that is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. Now, it's a very short definition for a very vast issue, right? So it's a good way of looking at it is sort of extrapolating from that one sentence, right? So if we take the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, we can look at what is entrusted power, right? And the broader the approach to these terms, the more effective the approach to anti-corruption is, right? So if we take entrusted power, it can obviously mean elected officials, right? High-ranking officials to the president to ministers, but also low-ranking public officers in public authorities. Those are also individuals with entrusted power. Now, moving away from what is commonly known in the public sector, right? You can also go to the private sector. There's entrusted power there as well, right? Entrusted power doesn't simply only apply to politicians or the public sector or the people you elect. It also is a contract that you have with your CEO or your manager, right? There's entrusted power there, right? So that's the entrusted power aspect of that definition. And then you look at private gain, right? So private gain doesn't necessarily mean, I think when people think of private gain, they think of one person with a massive kickback or lining your pockets. Understandably, yes. But private gain can also mean political parties, right? It can mean groups of individuals, right? It can mean groups of corporates, right? That can also mean private gain, right? Gain for those individuals and those groups. Then there's also financial and non-financial gain, right? Everyone knows the financial and the economic and the money aspect of corruption, right? Especially in terms of bribes. There's also the non-financial aspect of that private gain, which is things like elevating your social status, elevating power, right? Power grabs. And that also perpetuates to a cycle that allows increased power, more money being stolen, the more money you have, and then more increased power. So it's like this whole cycle, it's a whole network. And abusing this entrusted power for these gains through specific means, that is essentially what corruption is. So it's a broad definition, but the thing is, corruption has evolved over, the last few decades. Our approach to corruption has to evolve. Anti-corruption, rather, has to evolve with it. Right. So
thanks, Dhewni. So I think the definition was quite short in when you write it down, exactly. But it covers quite a broader area. Yeah. So even if you are from the private sector, public sector, regardless of your designation or where do you position in the hierarchy, are you a politician or a bureaucrat, it doesn't matter. This Correct. Applies if you are if the entrusted power is being abused,
yes,
that is corruption under any level. So from starting from that, however, in Sri Lanka, the popular terms are okay, so now someone has corrupted the money. Can we bring it back? Can we put them behind the bars? And why it's delayed? There are so many conversations around it. But let's go one by one. So you mentioned the corruption has also evolved. Could you kindly elaborate on that over a period of time and how organizations like Transparency International is looking at it on a different angle and also evolving to address the evolving corruption issues.
Understood. So by what I meant by so two things there, right? How is corruption evolved, and how can we evolve with it in terms of fighting it? So speaking to the first point, how corruption has evolved is it's gone from the understanding of just this exchange that is mutually beneficial between, a couple of parties or one or two parties to this entire network, right? What we call a kleptocratic network. And kleptocracy is essentially an elite group of people. And this doesn't necessarily concentrate to one country. It's also a global network, right? It's a network of elites that can essentially have access to states and state resources and the arms of the state, where they can benefit financially and non-financially in terms of power and, like I said, money as well, right? So there are these networks that have been built over decades, right? And they use, the best of technology, they use the brightest minds, and they have evolved, and there are these really deep-rooted networks. And we can't address that by just a very standard definition of, bribery or, the standard like, oh, you promise me this and I'll give you this. It's evolved way more than that. It's deeply entrenched in political systems.
So how do you address this with Transparency International, and what civil society organization, individuals, how should they look at it, and how they should change their approach on this matter?
Okay, so I think crucial is identifying that this is a very systemic issue, right? We all focus on these big headlines that we see, whether it's the bond scam or whether it's a controversial visa deal, right? We hear all these incidents, and there have been many throughout the decades in Sri Lanka. And by all means, it's very important, and focusing on how we can rectify those are important. But all of those happened in a system that enabled this, right? There are issues that, that needs to be addressed on a systemic level. And if we're talking about what those are, right? For example, just the discretion, right, that is awarded to people in power, in high-ranking positions, right, to make decisions which affect the entire populace, but there's absolutely no reporting on it. There's no transparency. There are no guidelines for them to follow. And even if there are no sanctioning mechanisms in the country that keep power in check, right? That's a huge part of it. In terms of you mentioned how to bring money back, right, to the country, which is a huge thing that everyone's talking about, during the protests and everything, bring us our stolen assets back. So the mechanism for that, or legal framework for that, is the Proceeds of Crime Act, right, which it's a stolen asset recovery law. And it's yet to be passed in Sri Lanka. I believe it is a recommendation. It's a requirement of the IMF as well for us to pass it. We have Transparency International has actually been a part of the drafting process, but unfortunately, it hasn't been very inclusive like laws should be drafted. It hasn't been a consultative process. We've had to really sort of fight to get in there, and it's an area of our expertise, right? It's a huge technical area in anti-corruption, proceeds of crime, and asset recovery. But we finally did, through many advocacy efforts, get in there and give our input to the draft law. So we're hoping that it'll come by soon, that it will be passed soon, maybe after, obviously, the upcoming election. But the importance of this framework is that it lays out direction in terms of how to go about bringing that money back, right? You can't just sort of you can't go to a country and say, hey, like, our money from this deal is in your country, give it back to us, right? There are processes. You have to initiate investigations here, right? You have to prove that this money is through illicit means, so illicit wealth, right? Then there needs to be government-to-government political will there, right? You need to sign agreements with mutual legal assistance agreements, is what they're called, with other governments. So their law enforcement agencies can also help you and recover in terms of finding the money abroad. So it's a huge process, right? And then when the assets are recovered, you have to make sure that they're not re-corrupted, right? So you can bring these billions of rupees back, but when they come back, where are they going? Who is taking care of them, right? Is there transparency in terms of how much money is coming back? Do the people know, right? If we are to, have these really complex processes and pass these laws, we don't have like transparency and accountability in our existing laws, right? They also leave room for manipulation, right? For like manipulation for your own personal gain. So again, it's every individual instance you can fix, you can do things, you can remedy, but it all comes back to this one system that doesn't allow for good governance, right? For progressive reform. And so asset recovery is also a really good example of after corruption has taken place, what can you do to sort of rectify it, right? It is always economically more viable to prevent corruption than it is to try and address it once it's been done, right? So for that, you need reforms. You need transparency mechanisms, accountability mechanisms, right? You need to remove discretionary spending and discretionary policymaking and opaque policymaking, right? So those things are what you can do to prevent, right? Because obviously much more economically viable to prevent corruption than it is to say, all these really, really complex processes take money, take human power, take, so many resources. So that's where we're at with asset recovery. And the process also takes up to 20 years. So
I would like to, I think you brought three very important issues. One is the discretionary power.
Yeah.
And the second one is it's easier to prevent corruption rather than after corruption took place to finding the money and, to kick in that entire process.
Yeah.
The third one is I think Sri Lankans are quite, I would say, enthusiastic about this asset recovery.
Mm-hmm.
So from what I understood, from what I gathered, that we do not have adequate laws, and the asset recovery law, which you have advocated, is in the draft stage, which has to be passed by the parliament.
Correct, yes.
Right. So till then, so in the anti-corruption law that was passed by the previous government, this part is not covered.
Asset recovery is not. No.
Asset recovery is not covered. No. Okay. So then when it goes for asset recovery, hopefully if this bill goes through, and are you as a civil society organization, are you happy with the draft law? You mentioned about some lack of consultation
Yes.
by all stakeholders, but whatever that you have seen as the last draft, do you think this is adequate for us to proceed? Because otherwise, again, when we start this process again, someone will come and say, look, there's some issue with this law, which we cannot do. How confident are you with this law? To very quickly to begin with, then I would like to go a little bit deeper on this asset recovery matter, asking about you the examples, whether any countries which has done it and what's the time period, and also on the process about like, by the time the investigations are going, probably they can transfer that money to some other account. So how are you going to trace it if it's like multiple countries involved? But first things first, how confident are you with the draft bill?
We're actually quite happy. I mean, we welcome this framework, and it's incredibly important, especially for a country like Sri Lanka, where we know so much money has been siphoned out. And to sort of get that process going is very encouraging. Like any laws, there are some gaps that we would like to address, and maybe even gaps that we would have missed as well. But in terms of the overall law, definitely we welcome it and we're happy.
Are there any benchmark or gold standards on these asset recovery laws around the world, or how does it work?
My knowledge, the EU asset recovery law is a good benchmark. And in terms of a comparison, we're not too far behind, to be honest. There are just certain things that, like, for example, it's important that the law aligns with other laws. Right, it needs to align. That's the case for any new legislation that gets passed. Right, it can't be contradicting to other laws. It needs to align with, for example, very important Right to Information Act. Right, it needs to align with the Anti-Corruption Act, and then we also have laws that we expect to come in, like the new procurement guidelines. Then there's asset declarations already going on, and then there's also the beneficial ownership register that was just recently almost introduced in the Companies Act amendment. So all of these laws need to align, right? That's the main thing. They need to align, and they need to sort of create a system. They need to create this like well-oiled machine, if you will, of preventing and also recovering, So all of these things help each other. So if you take beneficial ownership, right, the point of beneficial ownership is so that people, there's access to who really owns a company, who really owns these assets, who is the beneficial ultimate owner. And then you have asset declarations for officials who have to declare their assets, and this is how much we have, and these are the assets that we have. So now you put all of these together, you can see how important that is for asset recovery, right? So now when you're trying to determine if an asset, or a house or a car, whatever it is, right, is a product of illicit wealth, right, you need to be able to cross-check with an asset declaration of whoever is allegedly, owns that. You need to be able to cross-check with who are they accounted for in terms of beneficial ownership? Who are they the beneficial owners of? What companies? Do their asset declarations tally with actually having this much wealth, right? And, when there are discrepancies there, that's what that forms your investigation, right? So alignment with other laws is really important, is something that we've experienced.
Thank you. That clarifies quite a lot. Next step is in the process. Let's say hopefully this bill goes through and becomes an act. And when actually the process starts, how does it actually happen? For example, I think a lot of people have a suspicion that most of the funds will be in Dubai, or there's a big conversation in Uganda. However, wherever it is, so what happens? Because probably if they have so smartly siphoned the money out of the country, probably they will also transferring it from one account to the other. And how does it happen? Like when multiple countries involved. Imagine if those countries do not have those legal provisions. How does it work?
So the thing with asset recovery is that it does require, it's contingent on political will, right? And to a great extent, that can be quite discouraging because, as history has shown, we haven't seen much political will in terms of, good governance or reform or to something like asset recovery. There seems to be a change in that environment. There seems to be a sort of mind shift change. We can even look at the new president's manifesto, right? He explicitly talks about asset recovery. So if that political will is there, that's a huge step forward. In terms of a starting point, right? So in asset recovery, there is forfeiture. Right, so there's non-conviction based forfeiture and there's conviction based forfeiture, which is quite an interesting aspect of the law and also crucial. Right, it is contextually important to asset recovery that there is non-conviction based forfeiture because these assets can keep generating wealth, and by the time you can actually get a conviction, there's more assets that you have to recover. So that's a huge part of it. So the way that the law will work is there will be investigation officers. It will be with partnership. It will be over, I think not the regulating body, but the main body will be the CIABOC, the Bribery Commission. And they'll also work with the police, right? So there will be two heads called... There'll be the two main officers from the police and the CIABOC, and they'll have investigation officers under them. And so they can initiate investigations. As we know, CIABOC anyway can initiate investigations. So they can initiate investigations based off of information that they get of something that could possibly be an asset of illicit wealth. See, once they do that, there's obviously the very long, drawn-out investigation process. But now when it comes to sort of cross-country networks, most countries do have asset recovery laws in place, proceeds of crime laws in place. And even if they don't, there's always mutual legal assistance agreements that the countries can sign, which is why it ties back to that idea of political will being needed, right? Because mutual legal assistance agreements can be signed by the president, right? And so that sort of political will opens up a huge avenue for us because that cross-country collaboration can be done with that political will that is needed, right?
Just to clarify, so you mean the cross-country legal... What was the term?
Mutual legal assistance.
Mutual legal assistance can only be signed by a president, or you mean
a head of state?
Head of the state.
Yes.
Okay, so then only you can collaborate and basically get the investigations forward.
Yeah.
All right. So that's clear. So what is it? You mentioned the EU has sort of a gold standard, and you mentioned we are quite closer to that. And if hopefully when everything goes through, I'm sure It will take a little bit of like time, but what's the general timeline for this asset recovery? And also, are there any examples that actually this has happened where actually the assets being recovered, and like any numbers just gives, shed some light on this? Because I think everyone is quite enthusiastic on this to really understand where it stands at the moment.
Yeah, so in terms of a timeline, like I said, it is a very long, drawn out process. As you can imagine, it's not easy to sort of identify where these funds are and then bring them back. So the average sort of timeline, it can go up to about 20 years. So now we've seen...
average is 20 years. Okay.
It can go up to 20 years. We've seen... So I think a good example is, I believe it was... in the son of an African dictator, it was Michael Jackson's glove, the sort of diamond glove.
Right.
So that was actually really interesting, and like it's a known case because it's Michael Jackson's glove, but it was how he sort of stored his wealth by purchasing the glove. Right. So there was an investigation that authorities and civil society also very much involved that managed to get that back, and it was something along the lines of $30 million, right, in that glove. So there are definitely success stories. I think Nigeria is a really good example. They've managed to, with clergy and civil society involvement a lot, also managed to get back significant funds as well.
Excellent. Now let's go on to the prevention side of it. You mentioned about the discretionary power, and as Advocata, that's where we also coming into play, because why this transparency and anti-corruption drive is very important, because we believe this is fundamental for our economic growth. And what we see often is that discretionary power basically hinders on one side, the economic growth, and also it influences corruption, starting from the Strategic Development Act, where the minister has discretionary power on declaring tax holidays, so as like midnight gazette notifications on increasing tariff lines on certain like imports, goods and services. So tell us how people should think on this framework, because when you say discretionary power, generally people think like when you control more, when the government officials give they supervise, they sign something, that gives like more transparency, but in reality, it goes the other way around, according to my understanding. So tell us a little bit about how this framework, with the evolving nature of the corruption, which you mentioned initially at this conversation.
Yeah, so see, a good way of looking at it is that anti-corruption also entails checks and balances on power, right? And ministerial discretion in Sri Lanka is very close to almost no check. There's no check and balance on that, right? And like you speaking to what the example that you brought up in terms of the tax changes, right? The special commodity levy. And I think the best example of that is the sugar scam, right? And it costs the country so much money. It costs the country a lot of money. And that, in terms of how to think about that, is that there needs to be guidelines, there needs to be restrictions and regulations, even for ministers, in terms of making those decisions, right? And there's a parliamentary process for a reason. There doesn't need to be certain things that bypass that, right? And if you are to bypass those things, there needs to be very special circumstances, and that needs to be highly regulated as well, right? So ministerial discretion can't be used and can't be mandated for things that have such an enormous impact on a country, right? It's not like the day-to-day running of a ministry either, right? This is policy decisions. These are large-scale policy decisions that one person cannot be just making it at their will and whim and fancy. So that's where we're at. So this could require legislative changes, legislative amendments, like I said, to the special commodity levy. So these acts, a good place to start would be needing approval from Parliament, right? To actually make these changes, as opposed to making the changes. And, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think for a month, you have a month to report that you made this change, right, under the special commodity levy. So regulations like that really need change. They really need reform. And ministerial discretion and, so this concentration of power in general, it's very not conducive to good governance.
Got it. Dhewni, I think people are asking whether there's a quick fix for this problem. They want to see some results like yesterday.
Yes.
So are there anything that can be done? Because I have also been asked, like, okay, can we like cancel the 5,000 rupee note, so then people will bring their black money and then they will have to exchange it for the new currency note or something like that. So are there any quick fixes for this, according to your research studies and with the work that the TISL is doing?
So I don't know about quick fixes, but if we're looking at very short term, at least as short as we possibly can, for an issue that is going to take a while to address. If we're looking at short term measures, it's always good to look at existing frameworks, right? And how can we bolster those? Passing laws, introduction of laws, all very important, but the implementation, the operation of these laws take a while. People need to learn about the laws. The people who are implementing it on the ground need to learn about the laws. They need to learn the processes. So it's good to start with, in terms of, quick fixes, or where we can do in terms of the shortest term, would be existing frameworks, right? And a good place to start in terms of anti-corruption is our commission, the Commission to Investigate Allegations of Bribery or Corruption, right? Now, this is a commission that has an enormous amount of power comparatively to any other. It's the only commission. It's the only commission with prosecutorial power, right? So they can prosecute cases on their own. They have what's called suo motu powers, right? So they can initiate.
Suo motu powers.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So they can initiate investigations, right? They can prosecute. They can take things to the Attorney General. So making sure. So we have a body like this in place, right? It's already there. It's about making sure that they're funded, that they're resourced, that they're independent, right? Now, history has shown that, and not just in Sri Lanka, but history has shown that statutory bodies like these that are to act as a check and balance are intentionally under-resourced. They're intentionally sort of put down, right? But we have this great framework. It's about resourcing them, right? That's a quick fix. You can resource them, make sure that they're well-trained, make sure that they're independent and there's no political influence, encourage prosecution, encourage the pursuance of corruption cases and bribery cases. So this exists. It's about sort of revamping it, getting it to do its job, and allowing it and resourcing it to do its job, right? So that's one place to start. Our Auditor General is another really good place to start, I think, because over the years, I think it's not as well known as you would like to, because again, our reporting levels are so low, right? But Auditor General reports have shown so many discrepancies in so many government institutions, right? Sri Lanka cricket, right? The T20, the World Cup. There's a special Auditor General report on that. There are discrepancies in that. Most recently, the controversial visa issue, right? There's an Auditor General report on that. Then Sri Lanka Customs, there's a special audit report. These are just recent examples, right? And these audit reports show the discrepancies, right? It's there, it's in the papers, like it's in what they publish, right? But where's the follow-up action, right? Who is mandated to take these follow-up actions? You're being presented with these findings, right? And, whether it's the CIABOC or whether it's any other regulatory authority, the information is there, right? So a possible way forward in terms of that would be mandating either the CIABOC or you even mandating the Auditor General, right, to take follow-up actions, to open channels of communication between the Auditor General and line ministries or relevant authorities, especially the CIABOC. Because if I'm not mistaken, there's a section in the National Audit Act that actually restricts information sharing. Information sharing is crucial for anti-corruption, right? It's crucial for good governance. You need to, especially as an Auditor General, right? You need to have that power to actually do something with your findings. So these are things that exist, right? These aren't things like asset recovery where you have to go and, you have to implement the laws and you have to train people. These things they're already there, right? So these things can already be initiated. Maybe one more thing I can sort of touch on is, so our Attorney General's office, right? The Attorney General Department. So an issue that even TISL has sort of faced is that there's a major conflict of interest there, right? So the Attorney General is the Chief Prosecutor of the island, right? He is a Chief Prosecutor, but he's also the the government's defending attorney, right? So there's a major conflict there, right? How is the office rather to really take action on anti-corruption measures, on anti-corruption cases, and prosecute vigorously anti-corruption, when you also have to think about, defending the same people who these charges are being brought on, right? So an independent prosecution office is something that, I think any government should definitely look at in Sri Lanka, because this conflict of interest is seriously hindering prosecution, right? And corruption especially, right? Because, the link is right. It's very obvious. So those, I guess, 3 short-term or quick fixes, if you will.
Thank you, Dhewni. I think we spoke about pretty much like bringing the the stolen asset recovery, and on to an extent on the independent public prosecutor office, and what quick fixes that can be done. But on the prevention front and on the bribery, because I remember I was listening to Dr. Sarath Jayaman, and he said, especially the case on the bribery for the former president's secretary, which they caught and prosecuted, was mainly because having the courage for that businessman, the private business guy, who basically reported that this has taken place. And I think there's no secret of, according to your definition, this corruption is taking place in the private sector as well, in massive scale. So in terms of this corruption issue and mainly the bribery issue, what recommendations that you have, what TISL is working, is there a different framework that is required, or are there any legal bottlenecks that we have to clear out? How should we move to that direction?
Okay, so just to clarify, in terms of prevention, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so 2 things: to prevention and to speak to the sort of the ability for people to come out with information that they have, especially in the private sector, right? So speaking to the first point, in terms of prevention, it's those mechanisms that I talked about earlier, having those in place, right? So such as asset declaration systems, conflict of interest registries, right? Beneficial ownership registries. These are mechanisms that allow for more transparency, that allow for more accountability. What needs to happen is that whether it is social policy or economic policy or environmental policy, bad policy can't go unchecked. It can't be enabled, right? The more corruption, that enabling environment is huge, right? So reducing that enable environment, where bad policy can go unchecked and unaccounted for, unsanctioned, that's the goal, right? So transparency mechanisms, like I said, asset declaration systems and conflict of interest registries, where people can hold officials accountable, where they'll be deterred to do these things, because now people will know. Now there are things to sanction them. Now there are things to actually, bring to light their actions and why they're doing what they're doing. So that's a good place to start in terms of prevention as well. What is crucial, and I think this maybe not a quick fix, but what would be crucial for prevention also is the education on anti-corruption, right? The sort of mindset shift, especially I would say in both sectors, the public and the private. This sort of, I think when they hear corruption, they feel very persecuted. Like it's a scary word, right? So sort of changing that mindset of, no, actually these measures would help you too. This is not us coming and saying, these measures, and you go like, okay, but we didn't do anything. Like, why are you doing this? That's not the mindset, right? That sort of mindset shift of integrating anti-corruption, integrating good governance in everyday activities of public institutions and private organizations as well, right? So that sort of, it can't be something that faces much resistance, because if it does, then it'll be very hard to implement anything across the board, right? And we see the case with legislation that's already there, like, say, for example, the Right to Information Act, right? TISL experienced that, officials still feel like using the RTI it's against them. It's like we're persecuting them, right? So that understanding of why these mechanisms are there, why they're there, and what good they can do and what good they will do, that's also really important, right?
Dhewni, we are reaching to the last stage of our conversation. Also wanted to understand about the I think the IMF governance diagnostic report, and the civil society did another report, and most of the time my civil society friends are quite upset that we generally speak about the IMF governance diagnostic report, but not on the civil society report.
Okay.
But are there any drafts? Because for me, it pretty much covers the same content, and it is important that both sides doing it, because it's, when you say IMF, it's an international, agency, but the civil society in Sri Lanka has a better sense on the context and the ground reality. Do you want to bring out any major recommendations from that report which is actually missing in the IMF report, or which is complementing, where we can do things urgently? I would like to discuss on that.
Yeah, sure. So we can sort of tie it back to the things I've already talked about, right? So I brought up the issue with the Auditor General Office, right? And there's a very complimentary recommendation in the prior to recommendations of the IMF is giving the Auditor General the ability to levy surcharges on officers that, and sanction them in relation to corrupt practices, right? That basically empowering the Auditor General more. That's also that's a recommendation in the IMF. That's also very complementary to the recommendation of ensuring there's follow-up action by the Auditor General, right? That's a form of follow-up action. Let me talk about the report in general. It also covers short, medium, and long-term anti-corruption reforms and governance reforms, right? It covers tax policies, tax reforms, especially with the transparency and accountability angle, right? Tax exemptions. If you are giving out tax exemptions, who are you giving it to? Why doesn't the public know about it? What are the, how can we compare this year's to last year's? So things like that. Then it covers a lot of what we already talked about. So like the Proceeds of Crime Act, and it talks about, if I can try and think of something that we haven't already touched, the report talks about. Budgetary transparency is also something the report talks about that we couldn't really touch here. The importance of being able to assess budget variations, assess from, what was allocated, what was spent, where's that transparency. Debt transparency is another thing that we really focus on, debt integrity, right? So those are sort of, maybe I actually pick maybe debt integrity as something that we focus on a lot.
What is debt integrity?
So basically, it's the process of borrowing, right? It's not just at your just will and fancy of like, if there is funds, for grabs, you borrow. You have to. It's about borrowing for what you need, not borrowing just because you can. It's also about the terms and conditions of borrowing, right? That's what we've been starting to look at a lot, is that there's absolutely no transparency in Sri Lanka in terms of interest rates in terms of repayments, right? What are the agreements that we've entered into? And we've seen since 2005 onwards, right, there's been a huge shift from the conventional lenders to like commercial lenders, right? And our research has shown that, that's a common practice in the corruption sphere, because there's less rigid agreements and less regulations and less reporting mechanisms, right? But high interest rates in terms of repayment. Conventional lenders also very often are project basis, right? You get loans for specific projects, for specific goals, not lumps of money where you can discretionary decide on how to spend it. So that's generally what debt integrity is, making sure that there's transparency. And again, debt transparency in terms of how much money are we borrowing, how much debt do we have, right? We went through all of these years borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, and we saw these huge highways coming up and these huge infrastructure projects, but no one was focused on, because they didn't have access to information, or that wasn't publicly disclosed, where was this money coming from, right? And then, everything came to a head in 2022. But that's essentially where we go with debt transparency and debt integrity. So there is, like you said, a massive overlap with the IMF governance diagnostic and the civil society governance diagnostic. I think what doesn't touch, very, very obviously doesn't get touched in the IMF one is we also focus on civic space. Right, there's a recommendation that talks about, again, this enabling environment, right? You can't pushing for economic reform or anti-corruption reform in an environment that is devoid of any civic space, right? That is completely oppressive, right? Is redundant. It lacks any progress, right? For progress to be sustainable, right, there needs to be a proper civic space. It needs to be consultative, right? We're long gone are the days where, you know, laws are drafted behind closed doors, right? It's common practice now for it to be very consultative with civil society, with technical experts, right? So these are things that are covered also in the report that aren't in the IMF diagnostic.
Also, there was a conversation about on the money laundering, the banking system. You spoke about the importance of I think some of the reforms or the changes which is required for the companies amendment, but also on the banking system. For an example, when on the money laundering, if there's an suspicious transaction, whether there's an alert system. And in fact, I'm not sure whether you recall during the crisis, the then government basically said you can deposit any dollars, no questions asked, and they gave a time frame. I think that has happened multiple times, which I think affected also on the terrorist financing and money laundering guidelines that we have globally signed.
Yes.
Just wanted to shed light, because what we see is a repetitive cycle that there's massive corruption, there's bad governance. Again, when we are going for a crisis, again you forget everything, and then you say like, no questions asked, you send the money, and then this conversation comes, and this corruption conversation again everyone forgets, and then everyone goes through with something else, and again it's the same thing. Just wanted to get your recommendations, thoughts on this one, on the money laundering and having those how shall I say, the guidelines or the buffers to making sure on the prevention front again, but on the money laundering side.
Yeah, I mean, completely agree with you, right? It's so vital. And we do have anti-money laundering measures in place. We've actually done a research quite recently on them. So the important thing is, and speaking to that cycle that you brought up, right, which is again why these measures are so important, right? And everyone, like, why now is because we've come to this breakdown point, right? Now we're implementing these reforms, we're trying to get the economy back running. Now, do we want to do it superficially, or do we want to do it sustainably, right? Are we doing it in the same system that we have been doing it all these years, and where leakages occur, and then we're right back where we started? Or do we want this framework of prevention, of, if it's anti-money laundering, to all the measures that we spoke about in our discussion? It's about having these in place while those other reforms take place as well, while economic reforms take place as well, so there are no leakages, right? So, and anti-money laundering measures are 100% a part of that. Yeah.
Anything that you want to speak that I did not ask, but any other projects, any other important advocacy that you do to prevent corruption and on this entire very important conversation?
Not really. I think we covered quite a bit. Maybe just to touch on procurement, right? Just simply because there's been so much that's been coming up, right, in the country. And so much corruption risk exists in our procurement processes. And the reason I feel like it's integral to bring it up now, because there's also, we're expecting a new law on procurement, right? And
at the moment we have a procurement guideline, and we need a procurement
law. Yes, we need to enact a procurement law. We have national guidelines. So so many of the issues that we've faced as a country, so many of these scandals, if you will, that have been coming up over the last couple of years. Like I said, I think I mentioned the visa issue earlier, and then the medical procurement issue.
But those all comes again for your initial argument, the discretionary power, the cabinet just gives they have the discretionary power, and what as Advocata we bring out is open it for competition, because when you have that's one person,
right?
Exactly, that's procurement.
Exactly, yes. Right? It's competitive bidding. Exactly, right? 100%. So this issue is vital, and I mean, I don't have to go into these specific issues because everyone knows about the health issue and all of those things, but it comes down to procurement, and like you said, discretion, and procurement processes remove that discretion, that reduces that discretion, right? So, and there's also, like I said, a procurement law that we're expecting, and which brings me to one thing that I would like to highlight is, and I think I have throughout this conversation, but just one last time, the importance of public consultation, right? procurement is quite a technical aspect, right? And an issue with procurement is that we have this one-size-fits-all sort of approach, which we can't have, right? Procurement needs to be very specific to industries, to sectors, right? Otherwise, there's going to be resistance in terms of compliance, right? If the laws don't understand the environment in which they're supposed to operate, there's obviously going to be resistance in those who have to implement those laws on the ground, right? And in terms of making sure that this law that's coming up won't basically meet resistance and will be effective is public consultation, whether it's civil society, whether it's the private sector, whether it's technical experts, if it's international experts, whatever it is, it needs to be a consultative process. It needs to be a transparent process, right? Laws can't be passed within, a couple of days. They can't just pop up out of nowhere. They need to be consultative and they need to follow a proper process. So yeah,
thanks, Dhewni. So just to wrap up, the urgent things that everyone was looking for, like what can be done like yesterday or tomorrow, that's mainly financing or resourcing the CBOC.
Yes.
CBOC. That's the most important part, and hopefully when the new parliament is convened, that we can take forward the proceeds of
Crime Act,
and also on the stolen asset recovery act or the guideline in the parliament. So then I think the next steps we can move forward with the next steps, and also there can be some conflict of interest with the Attorney General's office by appointing a public independent public prosecutor or setting up an independent public prosecutor office. Some issues can be resolved on an urgent basis, but this is a long process and this has to be a continuous process. And so we hope that the citizens and Sri Lankans will rally around and fight, take the fight forward on this anti-corruption, because that's very, very important on economic development and economic growth. With this level of corruption, there is no way that we can reach to the economic growth that we all are aspired for. Dhewni, thank you very much for joining us and for your time.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you very much. We'll see you in another similar kind of episode on Advocata Institute, but you can watch the similar content on Advocata Plus, that's on our Sinhala channel, and also on Advocata Kural, which will be in Tamil. See you with another interesting conversation.